In our last video, we read through what is often referred to as Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. Luke has a much more condensed version compared to the Sermon on the Mount that Matthew records. And I mentioned in the reading that Luke has some very specific reasons for the setting around this sermon, and particularly the material he includes, although he doesn't include as much material as Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount is much longer than the Sermon on the Plain. It's really important for Luke, and it gives us an opportunity to look at what are often some of the most quoted sayings of Jesus and try to better understand them in their actual context. There's a lot going on with the Old Testament, with background to the first century, so a lot for us to be able to explore in our look at the Sermon on the Plain. So I've got the Sermon on the Plain in the previous video. Hopefully you read along with it, and we want to start off by specifically looking, as I mentioned, at some of the setting around this passage. Now, Luke has intentionally placed this sermon here, and he has some good reasons for doing so, and he has a very specific structure to the sermon, which we're going to get into. The setting, though, as a starting point, is for Luke perhaps as important in many ways as the content itself. If you remember in the previous videos, we've seen Jesus' ministry in Galilee that's been growing. We've also seen the opposition that's been growing as the Pharisees and leaders from Jerusalem have come questioning Jesus. And we've seen them interact on several important conversations. Questions about the titles Jesus is using, how he's describing himself. They've raised issues with his relationships with sinners, his approach to repentance that seems different than what they would expected. And all of this has really been in relationship to the law. These conversations, hopefully you've been watching the previous videos and you'll remember that all of these conversations have really been about how to interpret what the law says. Jesus has his way of understanding the law. His opponents have another way of understanding the law. And so really they've been having these kind of legal debates as we've been looking at them. That becomes important here as well. So Luke's question is really, what allows somebody to recognize Jesus while other people cannot? Because that's really at the heart of what's been going on. Some people, like Peter and the disciples, see Jesus, they recognize that he is more than just a teacher, and they literally walk away from their jobs and begin to follow him. They become disciples. But then you have legal experts, you have Pharisees who come, who in conversation cannot see that and actually think Jesus is speaking blasphemy. They're ready to silence or eliminate Jesus. So for Luke, the interesting question is, what allows some people to recognize who Jesus is and what Jesus is saying? And what seems to blind other people who may even have a great knowledge of the law and an expectation of a Messiah? What keeps people from recognizing Jesus? And that's a really important question, obviously for Luke as he's writing to a larger audience later on after Jesus' ministry within the days of the church. But it's just as important question for us today. I mean, two people can hear Jesus' words and one can see them as life-changing and literally reorient their entire life by them, and another can sort of shrug their shoulders and walk away. So what is it that allows Jesus' words to resonate with some while others seem to ultimately miss it? Now, other question about the setting, so we see what Luke may be doing. It's worth talking about the actual place, literally the physical place of the sermon. Is this the same sermon that Matthew records as the Sermon on the Mount? But Luke here is going to refer to it taking place on a plain. It's often called the Sermon on the Plain. And you can see that even in the setup to the two stories. So the Sermon on the Mount begins in Matthew chapter 5. Seeing the multitude, Jesus, went up onto the mount. When he had sat down, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and then the sermon begins. So you see where we get this definition of it being the Sermon on the Sermon on the Mount. And then in Luke chapter 6, we get something a little bit different. In these days, he went out to the mountain to pray. So we have a mountain in both of these. But here specifically, he's going to the mountain and going up on the mountain to pray, where in Matthew chapter 5, he seems to be going up on the mountain to sit and teach. Luke 6 continues, and he continued all night in prayer to God. Then he comes down with them. He calls his disciples to him, and then he comes down to them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great number of people. So we've got options here in front of us. Obviously there's a mountain in both. In Matthew chapter 5, he seems to be going up onto the mountain, then he sits and teaches from the mountain. In Luke 6, he goes up onto the mountain to pray, but then comes down from the mountain to this plain. And so some scholars believe these are two sermons. I mean, after all, I preach every Sunday, so preachers will occasionally circle back to the same material, especially somebody like Jesus who's traveling from town to town. There's always new people. He has a particular message he's trying to make. So it's very possible that he's preaching two sermons in two different locations, one on a mountain, one on a plain, and they just have similar material because Jesus is trying to make similar points. I tend to think these are probably the same sermon, that Luke has contextualized it differently. There's a mountain in both, and maybe a visual is helpful here as well. So, here's a sort of mosaic depiction of the Sermon on the Mount. And you get the idea from this image that Jesus is kind of on a sloped mountain, maybe that's going up. This would have been common because if he was at a higher elevation speaking down, larger crowds could have been hearing him and listening. But then the crowd at the base of the mountain is spread out on this broader plain. So perhaps they're both just describing slightly different things. In Matthew, he's on the mountain speaking down to the crowd, but perhaps he's been in Luke's gospel higher on that mountain and come down lower on the mountain so that he's now speaking to the plain. Luke choosing to prioritize the image of the people on the plain, where Matthew's prioritizing the mountain. I tend to think these are probably the same sermons, and both authors are just describing different elements of the setting, not differences, as if they were making up these elements, but they're highlighting different elements or different vantage points, different camera angles on Jesus's teaching. And I think Luke does it for a very intentional reason, because for Luke, Jesus going up on the mountain, both of them have Jesus going up, right? In Matthew, he goes up, sits down and teaches. In Luke, he goes up to pray, then comes down to the crowd. I think Luke sees Jesus on the mountain from a different vantage point connected to the Old Testament, and he's trying to highlight that connection because of how he's structuring his gospel. And so I want to show that to you because I think that will really help you understand what's going on here. So Luke tells us Jesus goes up to pray. I've already pointed out that in Luke's gospel, prayer is going to be really important. In fact, who knows, if we get to the end of this series and carry on into the book of Acts, which Luke is also the author of, you're going to see that theme of prayer continue through both of those books. For Luke, every time there's a kind of monumental moment, a historical moment, or a turning point in the narrative, almost always there is Jesus at prayer before that event takes place. So by having Jesus here go up to the mountain to pray, Luke is already setting this scene up as a kind of significant moment in the ministry of Jesus. This is how Luke records it, verse 12 and verse 13. In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and he continued all night in prayer to God. When it was day, he called his disciples, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. Now, pivotal moment here. The 12 apostles are named in this scene. It's set in the context of Jesus praying on a mountain. And then he's going to come down and give a sermon, which, like we've talked about before, many of these conversations are around how to interpret the law. We'll see that when we get into the sermon. So maybe if you're a student of the scriptures, there should be some sort of bells going off for you here in the way that Luke's describing this. A prophet or a man goes up on the mountain to meet with God. He comes down from that mountain to the 12 that are around him, and he imparts to them through speech the law of God, or in this case, his interpretation of that law. So if you know what I'm describing, this sounds an awfully lot like the scene of the Ten Commandments, the giving of the law in Exodus 19 and 20. I actually pulled it up so I can show you these parallels. So this is obviously Moses in this story. So there Israel camped before the mountain. So what do you have? You have Israel in the plain around Mount Sinai. While Moses went up to God, the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel." So what do we have here? We have a people at the base of a mountain. We have a man, a prophet, going up to communicate with God, and then being instructed to go back and speak to the house of Jacob. Well, what is the house of Jacob? Jacob's 12 sons become the 12 tribes. The house of Jacob is this people of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, so this is going to be the message Moses speaks, and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. And then what do we get in conclusion? So Moses came, and what did he do? He called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. So hopefully you see the really similar parallel here. Prophet goes up to the mountain, communicates with God. God specifically tells him to go down and speak to the house of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. And as he comes down, he calls to himself the elders. It's very similar to what Jesus is doing. Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray. He calls to him the 12 apostles and then goes down to the people and gives them this sermon or begins this discussion specifically about the law. Now, why does Jesus choose 12 disciples, 12 apostles? He's going to have a much larger group of disciples. Usually the word disciples can often refer to this massive group on the day of Pentecost. There'll be 120 of them praying. But out of this larger group of disciples, he calls these specific 12 apostles. And as I'm trying to make the connection here to the 12 tribes, does that mean that Jesus is somehow replacing the 12 tribes? I don't think that's the right way to think about this, but they are connected. One of the reasons you have 12 men, although Jesus will empower women in other positions later on in the early church the Spirit will be poured out on men and women. I've got a whole special lecture on that. The reason Jesus picks 12 men, I don't think is specifically because he's picking male leaders. It's because he's trying to replicate the 12 sons, the 12 fathers of these 12 tribes. And he's not doing it to replace the 12 tribes, as if Jesus is now replacing Israel. Instead, what he's doing is he's retelling the biblical story. And that's one of the interesting ways to think about Old Testament and New Testament. You have this story of God doing a work amongst his people, forming a people, shaping them, giving them this law. Then you have Jesus coming, who's retelling that story in a way by also calling and shaping a new people and giving them this new covenant through himself. And then if you read on into Acts, you actually get a third telling of this story, now through the power of the Holy Spirit. One of the first things the church does after Jesus' ascension is they replace Judas so that they can restore the 12, right? This becomes not so much about leadership as it is this forming of a people, this retelling of the story, that the same God who had worked in the Old Testament is now working through Jesus and now is working through the Holy Spirit. I think it's actually a way of thinking about the Trinity, that the Trinity is this story, this consistent pattern of how God forms and dwells with his people, and how it's told through the story of God with Israel, through Jesus to his disciples, and now the Spirit to his church. And so I don't think it's right to think that Jesus is literally replacing the 12. In other words, what he's doing is he's retelling the story. He's connecting himself to the story of Moses, the 12 tribes before, and showing them that he is doing what God had done and what God promised he would do. Paul actually makes a similar point, right? Because this question comes up even in the early church. So Paul will say in the book of Romans, I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. We could spend a lot of time looking at what Paul says there, but God is still very much involved in trying to fulfill his promises to his people, to the Israelites. But here Jesus is calling 12 apostles because he's modeling himself as Moses, the great prophet, greater than Moses, and he's forming a people like Moses through the law formed a people at Sinai. So hopefully you get that connection. I think that's probably really important to get. And you see why for Luke, the setting of this sermon is really significant for Jesus. It becomes the place he meets with God on the mountain, the place he calls his 12 apostles, and now he comes down and he begins this sermon like Jesus came down and instructed this new people. So let's get into looking at specifically the structure of the sermon. If you read along in the previous video passage, I kind of broke that structure down into 4 elements, and we'll look at each of those. They basically go like this. My numbers are a little off. Should be 1, 2, 3, 4. An outline of the sermon. Number 1, blessings and curses. Number 2, this topic of love that Jesus gets into. So love your enemy. The golden rule is in here. Number 3 should be number 3, judgment. This is the famous passage you've certainly heard about, judge not lest you be judged. We'll look at that in its context. And then should be number 4, Jesus basically gives 3 images or parables to help illustrate the points that he's making in the previous points of his sermon. So we'll walk through each of these elements of Jesus' sermon. And a quick reminder, these are the questions Luke has set up in the previous chapters. So I think part of what Luke is doing, Luke's a great writer. He's not just dropping random stories together. He's moving us through a single story. So remember in the introduction, how do you recognize Jesus? Who recognizes Jesus? What allows some people to hear Jesus' words while others miss it? And at the heart of that is Jesus' interpretation of the law, which has been the sticking point in these debates. So if the story's been building along these 2 lines, those who hear Jesus and recognize him, those who don't, the dispute over how to interpret the law, then it's no surprise that really at the heart of this sermon is Jesus addressing these very things. What makes a person capable of hearing his words and receiving his kingdom? And how does Jesus connect that to a proper interpretation of the law? If you get those elements, then I think the sermon begins to make a lot more sense. So where does Jesus begin? I think there's a kind of temptation here. You know, if I'm Jesus doing this big, think of this as like an inaugural sermon, right? This is the first big sermon that's recorded. you're going to start with something powerful. All the crowds are there in front of you. They've all come to see miracles. And why not come down from the mountain, do your miracles, and then deliver the message, right? Or set up the 12 apostles you've just called. I mean, this is kind of a milestone moment. And you would expect Jesus to open with this sort of big, grand introduction. But he opens with what are the blessings and the curses, which is, I think, in some ways, an unexpected way to start. I mean, Jesus' very first words are going to be, he lifted up his eyes to his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for God's kingdom is yours." Now, if you're making a big address to this massive growing audience with expectations and miracles and power and apostles and the backdrop of Moses on Mount Sinai, and your first words are, "You're lucky if you're poor." Blessed are you when you're poor. Blessed are you if you're hungry. Blessed are you if you weep. Blessed are you if men hate you. That's an unusual place for this sermon to start. But again, Jesus is trying to get at who can recognize his kingdom and who can't see it. And so for Jesus, the way to understand the blessing here is not just, it's better in life if you're poor. Well, that's definitely not true, right? It's better in life if you're hungry. No, it probably shortens your life if you're hungry. It's good and you should be happy if you're weeping, if people hate you. Sometimes people interpret these Beatitudes that way, right? Like, man, I know I'm going through a hard time, but it's just a blessing. It's actually a blessing. Maybe there's some general truth to that, but Jesus is saying something far more specific here. He's saying that and look at how he connects it to, it's not just blessed are you if you're poor. Blessed are those who are poor, for the kingdom is theirs. Blessed are those who are hungry now, for they will be filled. Blessed are you who weep, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you and exclude you and mock you and throw you out, casting your name out as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. So Jesus is connecting these things. You're blessed because in your poverty, in your hunger, in your weep, the kingdom is yours and the promise of the kingdom is yours. What Jesus is really saying here, I think, is the people who are able to recognize what Jesus is offering are the people who are in need. If you are poor in spirit, if you are mourning the brokenness of this world, if you're weeping at loss, if you know what it is to be persecuted, Matthew has it hungering and thirsting for righteousness, right? You wish things were made right. That kind of a heart of recognizing need is what allows a person to hear Jesus and to see how his kingdom is coming. Jesus connects this to one other important point because it's going to get paralleled in a moment. He also says in this point about persecution, the reason you should rejoice is you should also remember that their fathers did the same thing to the prophets. So in other words, if you're being persecuted, like Jesus and his disciples will be, remember that the true prophets of the Old Testament were also persecuted. I mean, this is true of many of the prophets who were put to death because of their prophecies, people rejecting the word of God. It's true of Moses as well. The great prophet Moses, the people are constantly complaining, plotting rebellion against him, wishing to go back. So if it went that way for Moses, they shouldn't expect that for Jesus and his disciples, people are just going to happily receive his words. If they didn't receive the words of the Old Testament prophets, why would they receive the words of these prophets? And so he reminds them that if you're being rejected, if you are receiving this kingdom in truth and others don't get it and make fun of you or revile you or even call you evil, just remember it's often been that way for those who received God's words through the prophets. So for Luke, the poor and the oppressed becomes a really important theme. And I want to talk about this for a second because I think this often gets misunderstood in Luke's gospel. You'll hear people routinely talk about how Luke as a writer has a unique interest in the poor, the outcast, and the oppressed. And it certainly is a theme that comes up in Luke's gospel. It comes up in Acts a lot as well, too. And so sometimes people will, in a really shallow way, they'll see Jesus paying attention to the poor, saying things like, blessed are the poor. And they will just immediately come to the conclusion that, therefore, Jesus has a kind of preference for the poor, or that Jesus gives special attention to the poor or the oppressed, and Jesus is somehow opposed to people of wealth. Now, there are strong biblical warnings about the temptation of wealth, the challenges of wealth. But I don't think Jesus is just trying to say poor people are good, rich people are evil. Sometimes it gets interpreted that way in our culture. Or I don't think he's just trying to say that it's better to be poor, it's better not to be rich. Jesus is using the images and the reality of poverty and riches to say something more specific about spiritual need. that the poor, because of their desperation, the sense of need that they have, need for a miracle, need for provision, need for assistance from beyond themselves, they have learned the skill for looking and listening for something they don't possess. The rich, by alternative, who can meet all of their own needs, who can fill their own bellies, who have all of the luxuries and joys, they are out of practice for recognizing spiritual need that allows them to hear and see what Jesus is saying. Jesus will use throughout Luke's gospel the rich and the poor as ways of talking about spiritual truths. Now, in the Beatitudes here, Luke uses very strong language, blessed are the poor. In the Beatitudes Matthew records in 5, he gives those the spiritual dimension that I think Luke is also driving at. Luke is just trying to make that point more strongly. So Matthew will say, blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. He's tying these images to those deeper spiritual needs, which is ultimately what Luke is driving at as well. And you get a sense of that when he gets to this next section. It's not just the blessings, but it's also the woes. So he continues, Jesus in his sermon, but woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. And woe when men speak well of you, for their fathers did the same things as the false prophets. Do you see he's paralleling each of the Beatitudes and the blessed statements? So if you're poor now, that need allows you to see the kingdom. But if you're rich now, you've already received your kingdom. If you are hungry, then that need will be met. But if you're full now, then you will later on be hungry, right? So he's balancing these two things. And ultimately down to the final point of the prophets, that if people often rejected God's prophets and those who received their word, then often what happened is false prophets, the people spoke well of and accepted and liked to hear their messages because it usually affirmed them. So if today people are speaking well of you and everybody's receiving you well, be careful, because perhaps you're just saying what people want to hear, and perhaps they're speaking well of you because there's no truth in your words. That's what ultimately Jesus is saying. So why are they cursed? Why is it woe to you? I don't think they're being cursed simply because they're rich, simply because their bellies are full, simply because they laugh, and because other people speak well of them. That if these things were true, all of a sudden you're cursed. Well, there's a problem. Number one, we have places in the Bible where people do speak well of believers, right? So you think of Acts chapter 2, this great summary of the church. God gave them favor with all the people, right? So people are speaking well. We're instructed to try to keep a good reputation with other people. I mean, that's one of the New Testament commandments. We're supposed to laugh with joy and rejoice. We're supposed to be full and be grateful for the food that's provided to us, daily bread. God does often bestow wealth and riches on us. He did throughout many of the characters in the Old Testament, and there were wealthy people in the New Testament that supported the church. Again, I don't think Jesus is saying that if you have money, if you're full, if you're laughing, and if people speak well of you and a good reputation, therefore you're cursed, condemned. What he's saying is be careful, because those are the things that can blind you to your need. You can begin to trust those things, and because of those things, not recognize your need for his kingdom. And he's not saying that life is better when you're poor and starving and persecuted. No, it's more difficult. But there is a kind of blessing in it, because in that need, it will turn you in greater dependence to God and allow you to receive from him in a way that riches can ultimately blind you from. I hope you're understanding that distinction, because it's really important to get what Luke is going to continue saying here. Ultimately, in both of those, the final statement is really about true prophets versus false prophets. That if you are those who are being persecuted, remember that the true prophets were also persecuted. And if you were being spoken well of, remember that's often how false prophets were treated. And also to put this in context, remember Jesus, when he begins these blessings and curses, he's not actually looking at the broader crowd when he says these things. It says, verse 20, he lifted up his eyes to his disciples and said. So one way to think about this scene is Jesus is standing before this large crowd. His own disciples are seeing the way Jesus' ministry is exploding. People are flocking to him. Jesus' reputation is growing as a miracle worker. And in the midst of all of this success, Jesus turns to his disciples and really reminds them about the true prophets. He really says to his disciples, when you see all of this success, be careful that you don't think success means you're a true prophet, because often the good word, the accepting word came to the false prophets and persecution came to the true prophets. He's really warning his disciples not to believe everything that's happening because Jesus knows that persecution is ultimately coming. Then Jesus extends an invitation to the larger crowd. So now he turns to the larger crowd. But I tell you who hear, he says in verse 27. So this is right back on topic. Who are those who hear what Jesus is doing and receives it? Well, Jesus will say to them, this large crowd with all of their expectations, to you who are really listening, to you who are here because of genuine need, who want to understand what I'm saying. And then Jesus begins really the main section of his sermon. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. So we want to look at each of these. I mentioned previously, love your enemies. Judge not lest you be judged. That's a famous line we'll look at. And then the images Jesus uses to describe, or these parables he uses to illustrate these points. So first of all, let's note that Jesus is raising legal questions here. When it can sometimes feel like Jesus is just dropping random sayings, right? He's just throwing out, hey, love your enemies. And here's another ethical statement, don't judge. And here's another ethical statement, do to others as you would have them do unto you. But Jesus is actually still coming back to the same conversations he's been having, legal questions about how to interpret the law. So one of those legal questions that was common in his day, Jesus is not making up this debate, one of those conversations that was central was, what are our obligations to the people around us? Who are we supposed to show love to? And where are the lines or the limits of how we're supposed to show that love to others? This is a legal question because it comes up often in the Old Testament. I want to give you a few of them. From Exodus 19, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbors as yourself. I am the Lord. So this sounds very similar to Jesus. Love your neighbor, right? Exodus 23. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, so your enemy's livestock, you should bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. So you're supposed to care for even the livestock of your enemies. Proverbs 25. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. Care for your enemy. Proverbs 24. Do not rejoice when your enemy falls. Let your heart not be glad when he stumbles. And then a really interesting from Psalm 139. This Psalm 139 one is really interesting because David is speaking. He's writing a psalm and he's saying something to the Lord. And this will become a question for many of the Jewish commentators. So David will say, do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? David's expressing his frustration here, hatred for those who are enemies of God. And so there's going to be a question about, is this, particularly for the Pharisees who are going to take the Psalms more seriously than perhaps the Sadducees. I've got a whole video on that. Is there a legal requirement here? Or is David saying it's okay to hate those who are enemies of God? This will become a big debate amongst the Jews for how to interpret this specific passage. And so you get evidence of that. I've got a couple of them from the Mishnah here and the Talmud. And I think these are really great because they capture the complexity of the legal question. Now, again, these are not scripture. These are rabbinic writings, some of them oral traditions that go back to the time of Jesus. But what they help us see are ways that Jews around this time period would have been thinking about these questions that Jesus is weighing into. So from the Mishnah, the Tractate Avot, one rabbi would say, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles. Sounds a little bit like Jesus, right? Lest the Lord see it and it displeases him, the Lord, and he turns away his wrath from him. I underline this one because I think this one's great. It kind of sounds like what Jesus is saying. Don't rejoice when your enemy stumbles. But it has a really interesting motivation. Motivation is, if you rejoice, God might actually stop punishing your enemy. So it's better not to rejoice so the wrath can continue on your enemy. Here's another one that's similar. If a man finds both a friend and an enemy requiring assistance, he should assist his enemy first. That's really interesting, right? Sounds like love of enemy. In order to subdue his evil inclinations. So here the motivation is a person should, in order to stop their own evil inclinations, to check themselves and their motivations, they should help their enemy first. Now, what gets exposed here is this doesn't actually sound like love for the enemy, but rather as a personal discipline of virtue, use this as a test for self-improvement. It doesn't, in the end, although it may have the same outcome and action, it sounds different than Jesus going so far as to say, loving your enemy. So Jesus is not, in this conversation about love, raising a new idea. What he's actually doing is he's trying to clarify what are probably ongoing legal discussions around his ministry and what he thinks and teaches based on the law. Jesus will say this: "Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. To him who strikes you on the cheek," familiar phrase, "offer the other cheek, turn your cheek. And from him," which, by the way, this is probably talking not so much about physical altercations as it is insults. To strike somebody on the cheek is to insult them. So probably what's being described here is not, if somebody's trying to murder you, turn and let them take a shot from the other side too. He's really saying if somebody's insulting you, if somebody's trying to dishonor or shame you, which is a major deal in this first century world, you shouldn't try to shame them back, but turn and let them insult you again. Show that you can handle this insult. If somebody takes your cloak, don't withhold also your coat. Give to everyone who asks you, and don't ask him who takes away your goods to give them back again. As you would like people to do to you, do exactly so to them. This is the golden rule, right? Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now, the big question becomes, as has been in the gospel already and will be again, who is my neighbor? Who is my enemy? What does it mean to show love? Really what the questions, these legal questions about are, where are the limits, right? Where are the lines when it comes to the law? So if I see a speed limit sign that says 70, most of us know you can get away with 74, 75, but there's some line there where eventually you're going to get pulled over and you're going to get a ticket. And this is the kind of thinking they have. Okay, the law requires a certain amount of love for neighbor, certain amount of love, or at least compassion, charity towards enemies. So they're trying to decide, where is that line that I need to be held accountable to? And what Jesus is saying by this passage is, you're asking the wrong questions. The law was leading people to look for the edges and not the actual heart. So the law wasn't instructing them on what to believe or who to be. It was really just instructing them on the edges of their own obedience, what they could get away with, what they couldn't get away with. So Jesus really blows apart this entire perspective. Where are the edges of the law? What are my actual responsibilities? How far am I legally required to go? And he sort of shatters that whole question by verse 31. As you would like people to do to you, do exactly to them. I don't know if you see how that fundamentally changes the question, but they're asking, what are the limits of my obligations to others? And Jesus flips that question and says, well, what would you like done to you? Well, if it's generosity towards me, I would prefer there to be no limits, right? If it's how far somebody should go to help me, I would prefer they go as far as they possibly can. So Jesus changes the question. If you would like somebody to help you, why then would you not extend that same help to that person? This is going to come up later in other parables. This is a really important question for Jesus. But here he begins to change the perspective of the question itself. And he has a particular kind of logic to it as well that I think drives the point home. So Jesus continues, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. I think this is a legitimate point, right? You're not different from the world. If you love those who love you, or if you give to those who give back to you, you're just making personal investments. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is it to you? For even the sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, so if you're giving just because you're expecting a return, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive back as much. But love your enemies, do good, and lend expecting nothing back, and your reward will be great. And then here's, I think, the final sort of driven in nail. If the first point he makes, right, the first hit of that hammer is, well, how much love and grace do you want shown to you? You should give that to others. Now he's going to take that one step farther and not say, how much would you like, but how much has been shown to you? And you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind towards the unthankful and the evil. The final point Jesus is ultimately going to make is, God has shown you grace and mercy. So therefore, how much grace and mercy should you show? So really two pieces to his logic that are really, I think, pretty profound. Number one, you wouldn't want there to be limits in the kind of help that people showed to you. And by the way, you wouldn't want there to be limits in the kind of help God shows you. So why do you live your life constantly trying to find the limits of what you're willing to do for others? That's ultimately Jesus's argument that he's making here about love your neighbor. He's getting at the heart of the law. To whom should I show love, and what are the limits? Jesus's answer, what kind of love and kindness has God shown you? That's I think, although they're talking about Old Testament obligations, Jesus sees beyond those legal requirements and really does get to the heart of what the law was trying to say. The law was trying to get them to think differently about their neighbors and enemies than the world around them. It wasn't trying to get them to a certain line. It was trying to change their entire perspective. And it was doing that modeled not on some arbitrary law God created, but the law was trying to reflect the character of God himself. That God is willing to show grace and mercy. He's willing to extend compassion even to those who oppose him. He has for his own people, even in their rebellion. Therefore, how can they imagine that what honors God is drawing hard lines and refusing to show that same generosity to others? Now, let's get to the next point, because Jesus then goes from this topic of love into this conversation of judge. And if you've heard the golden rule before, do to others you would have them do to you, you've certainly heard people usually refusing to be judged, saying, judge not. The Bible says you're not supposed to judge. This is where this comes from. So we need to do a little work understanding what Jesus is actually saying versus the way people tend to just throw it out there in quotation. Again, Jesus is one of his most quoted sayings. Therefore, be merciful. So he's connecting this to love, connecting this to the image of God who is generous. Therefore, you should be merciful, even as your Father is also merciful. Don't judge and you won't be judged. Don't condemn and you won't be condemned. Set free and you will be set free. So the question is Jesus saying, if you never judge, don't judge anyone, don't ever condemn anyone, never say anything critical of anyone, and you will never be judged, nothing critical will be ever said of you, is the point of Jesus's ethical teaching here. We should abandon all judgments about all things on all people. Well, there's a major problem with reading this passage this way, and it's that Jesus, throughout Luke's gospel specifically, is constantly judging. The Jewish leaders were asking questions because they saw it as their job to judge false teaching from true teaching. Jesus, just in the Beatitudes, talked about false prophets and true prophets. Jesus is trying to, by his blessings and woes, judge who is in the kingdom and who is not in the kingdom. And this becomes even more specific throughout the actual stories that Luke records. We haven't gotten to them yet, but you'll get this language very specifically. So from Luke 7, a certain lender had 2 debtors. So he's giving this parable, one who owed 500 denarii, the other 50. If you keep reading down, Simon answered the question, he, I suppose, to whom he forgave the most. And Jesus said to him, you have judged correctly, right? So their ability to interpret this parable, Jesus says, is a correct judgment. Also from earlier in John chapter 7, don't judge according to appearance, but judge righteous judgments. Jesus will specifically tell them that they're supposed to do their judgments with righteousness. He's instructing them to judge. Luke 22, I confer on you a kingdom, even as my Father conferred on me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. You will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. That the future hope is that these leaders, these apostles, will one day sit in positions of judgment. John chapter 9, Jesus said, I came into the world for judgment, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Well, wouldn't it be strange for Jesus to say, hey, my kingdom is not about judgments, my kingdom is not about condemnation, but he literally says in John's gospel, he came because of bringing judgment. Or from Luke 6, he says, you hypocrites. This is the passage we're looking at in just a moment, in the very same sermon. He will say, you hypocrites, first remove the beam from your own eye, then you can see clearly. I mean, this sounds to me like what many in the world would call judgment, right? You say, you hypocrite, and somebody in the world would say, don't judge me. The Bible says, don't judge. Well, Jesus is very clearly through the Gospels making judgments about things. So what is Jesus actually saying when he says, judge not and you will not be judged? If you keep reading, he says, give and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over will be given to you. And then I think this is actually his summary. Just like in the previous section, his comments about God's mercy really helped us interpret what he was saying before. This line is what helps us interpret the whole section before. For with the same measure you measure, it will be measured back to you, which is really what he's saying before, right? He doesn't just say, don't judge. He says, don't judge and you won't be judged. Don't condemn and you won't be condemned. So here he's talking about the way in which you measure or what you do is what you will receive in return. For with the same measure you measure, it will be measured back to you. So let's connect more broadly what Jesus is doing in this sermon and see if this makes sense. He's talking about those who have enough self-awareness of need, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, to recognize what he is offering, his kingdom coming. And that if they are in a position of need, they'll recognize how gracious God has been to them, how loving God has been even in the midst of their need. And so they will reflect the heart of that in their love towards others. And when it comes to the topic of judgment, they'll recognize that though they should be judged, because they have come humbly and repentant, they are now receiving that grace and mercy. Therefore, what they should extend to others is also a kind of grace and mercy, not in their refusal to call out need. Need is what gets you in. The ability to judge need and to see need is what gets you in. But ultimately, the way in which they live, the way in which they measure grace and love and mercy is the way that they will understand what God is giving them. They will see what God is doing for them in their ability to also extend that same to others. To make this make sense, Jesus is going to give a few illustrations, but I think the important point Jesus is making here about judging is, if you imagine a measuring stick, we had yardsticks in school, you'll remember. If you walk around the world constantly with this yardstick, measuring your obligations, constantly judging and measuring what's required of you, this is his point about the law, right? Trying to do just what God has instructed and measuring it all out, then ultimately what Jesus is saying is, you will be measured back by that same standard. But if you go through life trying to see and understand what God has given you, recognizing your need, then it will put you in a position where you will become a person of that same compassion, that same love. We're going to see in a moment that that will include the right kind of judgment. It doesn't mean no judgment, but it means that if you see God's grace and generosity, it will change the kind of grace and generosity you show towards others. Now, to drive this home, Jesus is going to give an illustration. And the first of these is really important for understanding this specific teaching on judgment. So 3 parables or images. The first, the speck that is in your brother's eye. The second, the fruit of a tree. And the third, this foundation of a house. Now, in the first parable, Jesus is going to say that many of you are like those who go around trying to remove a speck of dust from your brother's eye while you've missed the beam, or what's really the splinter in your own eye. He's describing you have an obstacle in your eye, some sort of a piece of wood, like a splinter in your eye. You can imagine how your eye would respond to that, how blurry your vision would be. But yet, instead of removing that from your own eye so you can see clearly, you go around blinded trying to remove the speck from everybody else's. And what's Jesus talking about here? He's talking about those opponents who keep coming to him and aren't actually listening to what he's saying. You come trying to correct every speck in my eye and all of these people who are in need, but you yourselves can't look long enough at yourself to recognize your own need. You can't recognize what's in your eye that if you would remove would allow you to actually help those around you better. Really what Jesus is getting at here is you won't be able to correctly judge what is going on until you turn and judge yourself. And in judging yourself, remove your own obstacle to blindness. Then you will be able to discern and judge rightly in the lives of the people around you. This is why judgment is not for Jesus a matter of don't judge. It's really a matter of, can you judge yourself first? And by that measure, then you'll be able to be measured by God. Then you'll be able to serve others. But really the attention begins with you. And that's the obstacle that's keeping so many of these leaders from understanding Jesus. They're not coming in their own position of need. They're coming in a position of judging, but they've not first judged themselves, their own motives, and discovered they actually do need what Jesus is offering. Then in the second parable, Jesus is going to talk about a fruit tree. He'll say that it's out of the heart, it's out of what the tree is, the health of the tree, that it bears its fruit. So for Jesus, these judges like to go around looking at just the fruit. But really for Jesus, the question is not the fruit. The question is the heart. The question is what's really motivating. It's this thing beneath the surface, right? It is about need and a realization of our own need. And then the final illustration Jesus makes is these 2 houses. There are those who, and for Jesus now, this kind of closing argument is, you're hearing what I'm saying. Some of you will go and actually do this. You'll live this out. You'll hear, receive, and go live this. Others of you will hear and perhaps even shake your head in agreement and then go right back to living like you were. Jesus says that those who will do what he says build a foundation beneath their house that will secure their life. But those who hear what he's saying and don't receive it and live it are building a house like it's on sand, and the first time obstacles come, the house will be knocked down. Jesus, I think it's a great image that builds on these other ones. What does the work look like? It means judging yourself, removing the obstacle in your eye. It means inventorying your own heart, looking at what's in your heart because it will bear fruit. And then it means not only just receiving the miracles of Jesus, but listening well enough to Jesus to build a life on this so that your life can have a deeper foundation versus taking what you can use, going on and finding there was no foundation to your house at all. You really see how each of these are not random images, but Jesus is building a case for why you should judge yourself, why you should receive what he's offering, and why you should go live it out as a new foundation for your own life. Here is, I think, in the end, Jesus's main point, the thing Jesus has been driving at. All of this attention has been on judging him, debating him. People still, after everything he said, cannot receive from him or understand what he's actually offering. So the main point of this sermon is you should take all of that attention, all of that judgment, all of that legal wrestling, and you should turn it around and place it on your own life. Interrogate your own life. Look at your own heart. Question the fruit. Look at the foundation you've been building. Remove that log from your own eye until you're willing to judge yourself with this same level of honesty. You won't ever understand your need. And until you understand your need, you won't be able to receive or understand what Jesus is saying. That, in many ways, that is the theme that Luke has been building throughout this entire gospel. It's the point that he's been driving to. It's the tension between the crowd who receives and doesn't. And so this sermon is really Jesus just articulating, if you want to understand who I am, it's going to require you to judge yourself, to recognize your own need, and to listen to what I'm saying out of that position, that posture of need. Let me give it to you in a couple of good commentators that I really like. They will, I think, be helpful in understanding what I'm saying as well, too. Their words may be better than mine. So one commentator writes, "The fault is judging others without first judging oneself using the same measuring stick. The order is judge yourself first, then you can move to help rather than judge another." Or I really like the way this commentator put it. Their judging had turned into a pseudo-religion, which is forever trying to make other people better, and the cure for it is a mirror. What a great way of putting it, right? Their whole religion had been about figuring out what everyone else was doing wrong, when really what they needed was to take, not to say, well, who cares about right and wrong? That's what the culture says, right? Well, just let everybody live their truth. There's no judgment. That's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying you should take that same judgment, that same critique, and turn it, you need a mirror, turn it on yourself. And once you begin to be that honest and critical of yourself, recognizing your own needs, that will humble you, change you, and now make you open to hearing and receiving what Jesus is actually offering. Turn the attention to yourself. A little bit of a quick summary before we wrap up. All the attention was turning to judging Jesus as the crowd was building. Jesus turns that attention back around on themselves. Blessed are the poor, those who recognize their need. If you could get this sense of need, then everything about his kingdom is open to you. How you would like God and others to treat you, treat others that same way. You see how the judgment's turning back, the introspection's back on myself. How would you want to be judged, and what do you use to judge yourself? You should use that to judge others. We'll talk about this more in our reflection video that's to come. And then finally, if you'll remove that log from your own eye, that speck will be a lot easier to help in your neighbors. All of this is about introspection on the self and recognizing your own need. Those who see their need are the ones who ultimately see and are welcomed into Jesus's kingdom. So, blessed are those who have need. Blessed are those who need what I have come to give, is Jesus's final point. If you are not in need, you will not understand what Jesus is offering. But if you judge yourself and recognize in humbleness your need, then what Jesus is saying all of a sudden becomes an unbelievably good news, a good word to you. So that's going to wrap up our study today of the passage. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I think there's so many interesting things, not only Jesus is saying, but the way Luke is using it in the story and connecting it to the Old Testament. I love seeing that Jesus is not just throwing out ethical teachings, but there's a logic to what Jesus is doing, and it's related to the questions of the crowd around him. Just really interesting passage. But there's a lot we could apply from this. I mean, I've already been doing some of that as we've talked about turning that attention, judging ourselves, what it means to love neighbors as God God has loved us. But in our reflection video, I want to dig in, offer you a few more illustrations to really hopefully maybe help you take this lecture and apply it to your life in a more meaningful way. So if you've not subscribed, like the video, maybe share it with somebody you think it would be helpful with, and then we'll get in the next video into the reflection and really try to figure out how can we live this? What can we do with this Sermon on the Plain?